Within minutes of US soldiers entering the village of My Lai in 1968, gunfire echoed through the trees. Army Captain Ernest Medina had already issued his order: kill anything that moved. As troops advanced, more than 400 unarmed people were killed before sunrise. Above them flew Chief Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson. Unaware of what was unfolding below, he called for medical assistance for a wounded woman. But before help arrived, she was executed at point-blank range by a member of the 2nd Platoon. Thompson, realizing what was unfolding, landed his helicopter between the injured and the approaching soldiers. He instructed his crew to protect those on the ground, and if the need arose, to open fire on their own men. Thompson confronted Lieutenant William Calley. Calley insisted he was following orders. Thompson returned to the air and searched for survivors. He and his crew, Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andriotta, evacuated a young boy they found beneath bodies. They returned to HQ and reported what they had seen, and only then, as the information moved up the chain of command, did the order come to stop the shooting. Initial reports within the military attempted to present the operation as a victory. Some soldiers received medals. Thompson was given a citation praising his role in improving relations with villagers caught in a crossfire. He discarded it. Formal investigations followed. Thompson gave the same account in every forum: unarmed civilians killed at close range by US soldiers. His testimony preventing the massacre from being hidden. Reactions varied. Some accused him of disloyalty for confronting fellow Americans during the evacuation. Threats were sent to his home to silence him, but he never stopped speaking. Calley was eventually convicted of murder, though his confinement only lasted a short period. Most others involved in the massacre were never punished. Recognition for Thompson came decades later, when he and his crew received the Soldier's Medal, an award for bravery without direct contact with an enemy. When Thompson died in 2006, survivors of the ditch sent flowers and letters in his memory. Hello, and welcome to Sleep with History. This channel is new, so please support it with a like, comment or subscribe. These videos are always ad-free, so please consider joining me on Patreon for just £3 a month. The events at My Lai did not arise in isolation. They reflected a system shaped by decisions made long before that day. When France withdrew from Indochina in the mid-1950s, the United States increased its involvement in supporting the Southern administration. Decision-makers viewed Vietnam through the framework of Cold War containment. They believed that if one country in Southeast Asia adopted a communist government, others might follow. This view shaped policy goals and guided spending, deployment and training. Planners expected an organized military opponent, but opposing forces in Vietnam often avoided direct confrontation. They operated in dispersed settlements, moved along familiar paths, and blended into everyday life. This challenged conventional assessments of progress. It was unclear how to measure whether operations were effective. To resolve that uncertainty, the United States introduced quantifiable indicators. Headquarters evaluated success through reported numbers: enemy fighters eliminated, areas cleared of opposition, or communities classified as secure. Commanders understood that higher totals would be interpreted as advancement. These figures influenced both planning and behavior in the field. As the conflict expanded, tens of thousands of US personnel were deployed. Advisors who had once worked alongside local forces now directed operations with large units. Each branch collected data in formats suited to its own needs. Reporting systems were not designed to capture the complexity of a conflict fought amongst civilians. They were designed to produce metrics. Assumptions about the population followed. When units encountered settlements where supplies, rest, or movement were possible for opposition forces, the people living there were often treated as contributing to the fight. Officials reasoned that armed groups could not function without support from those around them. Therefore, if a location remained outside government influence, its inhabitants were judged sympathetic to the other side by default. These views shaped rules of engagement. Controlling territory was seen as essential. Denying support to armed groups became a primary objective. If a place provided food, shelter, or information to opposition fighters, then removing those resources was viewed as necessary for success. Structures could be destroyed if they were believed to have been used to assist the enemy. Movement could be restricted or punished in areas where opposition activity was reported. Intelligence collection faced limits that increased the effect of these assumptions. Field units depended on interpreters or informants whose reliability varied. Many families avoided speaking openly due to fear of retaliation from armed groups who operated nearby. Silence could be interpreted as evidence of collaboration. Villagers, unable or unwilling to provide names of fighters, were sometimes judged complicit. Maps of influence were created with incomplete information. A settlement that did not show visible allegiance to the government might be listed as hostile. Once a classification appeared in reports, it carried forward into later operational plans. The designation did not require constant verification. Doubt about loyalties was often enough to maintain it. Aircraft and artillery supported operations based on those classifications. Pilots and fire support units target areas marked on maps, rather than specific individuals on the ground. Decisions made at distance carried immediate consequence. From far above, daily life and enemy presence were indistinguishable. The expectation that civilians would leave if danger approached did not account for older people, children, or those who lacked transport or safe destinations. Training materials emphasized that combatants could appear similar to everyone else living in a settlement. Guidance stated that weapons might be concealed or discarded at short notice. This raised the risk that any object held by a person encountered could be interpreted as a threat. A tool used for harvesting or building might be mistaken for a weapon at first glance. Reporting processes supported this shift in perception. If a unit fired upon someone who did not carry visible arms, the absence of proof that they were civilians did not always prompt reconsideration. Many reports recorded deaths as enemy casualties, unless evidence existed to show otherwise. Lethal outcomes therefore contributed directly to measures of progress. Once counted, those figures shaped future decisions. Coordination among different commands was affected by the volume of operations. Data summarized in short signals or radio messages traveled upward quickly. Longer explanations often did not. A single figure, the number of enemy killed, could represent a situation that was far more complex. Analytical tools designed for one type of conflict were being applied across the board. The growing presence of US forces increased pressure to produce results. Personnel rotated through assignments, aware that promotion depended on performance evaluations tied to quantifiable achievement. Units avoided returning from a search without a reportable engagement. Some commanders noted privately that these incentives rewarded aggressive action regardless of whether targets had been correctly identified. Attempts were made to refine guidance over time, but adjustments came too slowly. When harm to civilians was raised in internal discussions, responsibility was usually placed on individuals rather than on the structure itself. Official statements continue to highlight intentions to protect non-combatants, yet decisions taken to achieve measurable outcomes often worked against that aim. Field operations continued according to the assumption that eliminating perceived support would weaken the opposition. This produced patterns of action that treated people living in contested areas as part of the battle space, rather than as a protected population. The system did not require explicit orders to cause harm. It required only that personnel follow guidance that equated progress with casualties. By the time of the operation at My Lai, these elements had been in place for years. Strategy emphasized measurable results. Reporting systems converted uncertainty into certainty through classification. Interpreting communities as extensions of the enemy had become ingrained. The outcome in that village reflected structures that long predated the events of the morning. As U.S. involvement expanded, Southern administration and its allies sought to control territory considered vulnerable to opposition influence. Policies were developed to move inhabitants from locations deemed unsafe into areas under government supervision. Officials argued that relocations would separate armed groups from potential sources of assistance. The number of people directed to leave their homes grew steadily. By 1967, internal U.S. and South Vietnamese data estimated that more than 1.5 million people had been forcefully relocated under various security programs. Families were told to pack what they could carry and travel to settlements constructed for this purpose. Some relocations occurred with advance notice. Others took place during operations with homes destroyed shortly after residents departed. The speed of these changes left many without their possessions or means of earning a living. Conditions in the controlled zones varied. Some locations received steady supplies and medical attention. Others faced shortages, crowding, and health concerns. Local administrators attempted to keep records and distribute resources evenly, but infrastructure often could not match needs created by population movement on this scale. Families reliant on land for food discovered that assistance did not always arrive in time. Those who remained outside these protected zones faced increased danger. Commanders treated ungoverned areas as likely points of contact with the opposition. Movement along paths or roads could draw attention. Encounters were interpreted through assumptions that individuals who had not been relocated might be aligned with armed groups, assumptions affecting how patrols responded. Measures to deny shelter or supplies to enemy forces continued across wide areas. Structures that might provide rest or storage were marked for removal. When a settlement was declared hostile, artillery or air support could be used without further verification. Decisions by field officers reflected the belief that those still present had chosen not to comply. People caught by these operations had limited opportunity to show otherwise. Counting those displaced became a method of assessing progress. Provincial reports listed numbers relocated as indicators of success in reducing the reach of the opposition. These reports often lacked detail about what happened after relocation, or whether families were able to maintain livelihoods. The focus remained on totals. Long-term consequences followed. Older residents sometimes struggled to adapt to new surroundings. Those accustomed to farming found themselves without access to land. Work was available in towns, but often required skills that many did not possess. Some families returned to their former homes when the presence of troops lessened, hoping to recover stored goods or salvage crops. But return carried risk. Areas once described as cleared remained under observation. Patrols did not always expect to find civilians there. When soldiers encountered people in these locations, assumptions of hostility sometimes prevailed. Individuals attempting to retrieve belongings could become casualties of operations designed to eliminate remaining opposition. Movement restrictions added further strain. Checkpoints monitored entry and exit from controlled areas. Travel required permission. People seeking medical care or to visit relatives might face delays. Interactions with soldiers at these points depended on communication through interpreters or hand signals. Misunderstandings could escalate quickly. The loss of property affected entire communities. Livestock provided food and income before the conflict. Destruction or confiscation removed that support. Families sold valuables to survive, and their debt increased. Assistance programs attempted to mitigate hardship, but could not reach every settlement. The pace of operations outstripped the pace of reconstruction. These changes altered population distribution across the country. Towns near major bases expanded as displaced people arrived seeking safety and work. Meanwhile, significant stretches of the countryside emptied. Facilities established to host large populations struggled with sanitation and resource allocation. Health concerns rose, particularly among children. Efforts to protect those relocated included the construction of defensive perimeters and the establishment of administrative oversight. But these protections also introduced strict controls over daily life. Movement outside the perimeter was limited. Surveillance increased. Although described as protective measures, these controls reinforced the sense that the newly settled population remained under suspicion. As these policies expanded, the scale of disruption became evident. Over 1 in 3 inhabitants in the South had been forced to move at least once by the late 1960s, with some districts reporting displacement rates above 60%. Aid agencies recorded increased dependence on external support, and the ability to resume normal life diminished with each move. For many families, homes were no longer places they could return to. Clearing territory was intended to deny the opposition space in which to operate. It reduced the number of places where fighters might find resources or shelter. But the same policies reduced the abilities of families to sustain themselves. Actions taken to weaken one side of the conflict repeatedly harmed those who had no role in the fighting. The system of designated hostile zones did not rely on individual decisions about who posed a threat. It relied on classifications applied broadly, sometimes for long periods. Once a location appeared on maps as unsafe, its status shaped operational planning even if circumstance changed. By 1968, government figures recorded more than 3,000 settlements formally classified as insecure or requiring full clearance. Many later appeared on operational maps as zones where force could be used without additional checks on the presence of civilians. The designation itself changed the risk for anyone who remained. By separating families from their land, removing their means of support and restricting movement, displacement policies reshaped life for a large segment of the population. They created conditions in which civilians were more vulnerable during ongoing operations. The same measures viewed as necessary produced widespread hardship that continued long after the policies were introduced. Operations conducted across the country frequently resulted in the deaths of people who were not taking part in combat. These outcomes were not confined to one region or one set of circumstances. They emerged wherever units were instructed to remove opposition influence by force. The underlying methodology framed harm to civilians as an expected cost of progress. Field commanders relied on the appearance of success as measured by reports. If an encounter resulted in deaths, those deaths were usually recorded as enemy's casualties. This convention placed the burden of proof on anyone claiming that civilians had been harmed. In the absence of explicit evidence to the contrary, lethal force was treated as justified. Some units adjusted circumstances after engagement to ensure that reports aligned with expectations. Bodies of people killed during operations were occasionally photographed with weapons placed nearby. Documentation described them as combatants, even when no evidence supported that classification. These practices reinforced confidence in the strategy rather than prompting review. Attempts to investigate specific incidents provided further insight into systemic causes. In several inquiries, soldiers reported uncertainty about guidance on distinguishing civilians. They described pressure to act assertively to avoid casualties among their own ranks. Patterns became visible through the accumulation of these reports. Civilian deaths tended to increase in areas where operations eliminating enemy influence rather than protecting people living there. Night operations heightened the risk. Limited visibility and unfamiliar surroundings meant that interpretation of sound or movement relied on instinct and assumption. Engagements at night consistently produced higher civilian casualties than operations conducted in daylight. And with advancements in air and artillery support, the scale of harm was magnified. When commanders judged that a settlement assisted opposition forces, strikes could be authorized without confirmation of who remained inside. Examination of some strike locations after the fact showed that those inside were unarmed families who had not relocated or had returned to salvage belongings. Medical assistance for those harmed during operations was inconsistent. Some soldiers provided aid. Others were instructed to move on quickly to meet objectives. Injured civilians left behind without support were not reflected in engagement statistics. Only those confirmed dead during operations appeared in reports. The pressure to produce results influenced not only how forces acted, but also how outcomes were recorded. If a patrol returned without reporting contact, its actions might be questioned. Units noted that success required demonstration. In this environment, ambiguity was resolved in favor of confirming enemy losses, even when the evidence for that classification was weak or absent. Command reviews seldom examined whether the policy framework itself encouraged misidentification. Instead, reviews tended to focus on whether troops followed their orders as given. If actions were consistent with written directives and expectations, the outcome was accepted. The question of whether the directives were compatible with the protection of civilians was rarely addressed. The consistency of these outcomes across geography and units indicated that civilian deaths were not the result of isolated failures. They were a product of a system that defined progress in terms that did not distinguish clearly between those engaged in combat and those attempting to live through conflict. By the late 1960s, internal files documented repeated incidents in which civilians lost their lives during operations. Some reports recommended further inquiry. Others were archived without action. Even when the patterns were recognized, the strategic goals guiding the conflict remained unchanged. Units continued to operate in ways that converted assumptions into lethal results. Understanding how civilian deaths became widespread requires examining the alignment between policy, reporting, and field decisions. Instructions encouraged action in support of measurable goals. Reporting systems treated all deaths as progress unless proven otherwise. This combination ensured that many lives lost during the conflict were counted as victories in official records. The organization of command in Vietnam created pressures that shaped how the war was fought and how it was understood. Success was measured by numbers, promotions, commendations, and continued funding depended on data that appeared to demonstrate steady progress. Reports listing high enemy casualties traveled upward as evidence of effective leadership. Reports showing uncertainty or lack of contact did not. Officers at every level understood these expectations. Field units were instructed to be proactive, to seek contact with opposition forces, and to report measurable results. Failure to do so could lead to reassignment or negative evaluation. Within this system, caution was interpreted as weakness and restraint as inefficiency. Command culture favored decisive action regardless of the clarity of the situation. Body counts replaced traditional territorial measures as the primary indicator of success. Some operations were extended beyond their immediate objectives, simply to raise figures. Units returned from missions with reports detailing numbers that had not been independently verified. This reliance on data created a feedback loop. High casualty counts were rewarded, reinforcing the idea that the approach was effective. As figures rose, headquarters concluded that the strategy was working and ordered its continuation. In reality, many of the numbers represented deaths of innocent people. The system validated itself with the information it generated. Efforts to refine reporting procedures met resistance. Officers who questioned the accuracy of figures risked being seen as obstructive. Some attempted to implement local verification, but confirmation was difficult under the conditions of the conflict. The practice of recording unidentified bodies as enemy combatants continued. It ensured that progress reports would not decline. By 1968, internal documents showed that some divisions were reporting tens of thousands of enemies killed each year. These totals exceeded estimates of actual opposition strength in several regions. When discrepancies appeared, analysts attributed them to movement of fighters across borders or to the presence of uncounted local militias. Few suggested that the data itself might be flawed. The assumption that success could be quantified through deaths remained intact. Commanders who attempted to emphasize civilian protection found that such priorities were difficult to reconcile with expectations from above. Limiting firepower to avoid non-combatant casualties reduced recorded achievement. A commander who returned with few reported engagements was viewed to be ineffective. The structure of reward made ethical caution administratively disadvantageous. Advisors noted this contradiction in internal correspondence. Some wrote that pressure to report progress undermined the credibility of the information being sent to Washington. They warned that the appearance of success did not reflect conditions on the ground. These concerns rarely altered practice. The need to maintain confidence in the war effort outweighed the doubts raised by individuals. Intelligence officers faced similar constraints. Gathering accurate information required time and trust from local populations. The operational tempo left little space for either. When figures were demanded for planning purposes, analysts extrapolated from incomplete data. Estimates became accepted as fact once they appeared in official summaries. Strategic direction rested on these approximations. The hierarchy of incentives extended beyond the battlefield. Political briefings in Washington relied on statistical indicators that conveyed momentum. High-level summaries translated battlefield reports into charts and presentations. Positive trends reinforced public claims of progress. Few at the top level sought to examine the underlying data in detail. The system had become fully self-sustaining. Attempts to modify evaluation criteria came late in the war. Proposals to measure progress through population security or local governance faced bureaucratic resistance. Such metrics were harder to quantify and did not produce the clear numerical patterns that supported existing command reports. As a result, the body count system remained the dominant measure of effectiveness until the final years of U.S. involvement. Civilian detentions expanded alongside the clearing of settlements and classification of areas as unsafe. As families moved through military checkpoints or remained in locations where operations continued, individuals were frequently taken into custody for questioning. Authorities believed that obtaining information from inhabitants could assist in locating opposition forces. The assumption that knowledge implied complicity shaped how people were treated once detained. Facilities used for questioning varied widely. Some were established near field bases and staffed by personnel with limited training. Others were located in provincial centres and operated under advisory oversight. Procedures for handling detainees were not consistent. In some places, clear guidance existed. In others, decisions were left to local interpretation of broad directives. Documentation from advisors recorded concerns about coercive methods. Reports noted that detainees were sometimes subjected to physical force intended to compel cooperation. The legitimacy of information obtained this way was uncertain. Some individuals provided names or details simply to end the interrogation. Others remained silent, which interrogators could interpret as further evidence of involvement. The separation of families during these operations created further distress. Children and older relatives were left without support when adults were taken away. Some who were detained returned within hours or days. Others remained in custody longer, held while officials sought additional information. Communication with relatives was limited, families not knowing where the detained members were held. Sexual assault was widespread during interrogations and searches, though documentation of such acts was restricted to internal reports. Statements collected by advisors described incidents during which soldiers used coercion in ways that caused lasting harm. These actions did not appear in official summaries of operations. When raised, they were sometimes recorded under general categories of misconduct without specific reference to victims. Deaths in custody were recorded for administrative purposes, but rarely captured the circumstances that led to them. Explanations often cited escape attempts or sudden aggression. In some inquiries, testimony from other detainees contradicted these claims. Documentation confirmed that certain cases involved unarmed individuals who did not present a threat. The lack of detailed oversight made accountability difficult. The treatment of civilians during operations outside detention facilities followed similar patterns. In areas classified as unsafe, interactions during encounters were shaped by assumptions. Commands instructed soldiers to ensure control of those they encountered. Physical force was used to secure compliance. Communication barriers and the stress of unexpected confrontation contributed to misinterpretation. Checkpoints were established to regulate movement. Compliance required understanding of instructions delivered quickly, sometimes in languages unfamiliar to those passing through. People carrying possessions could be viewed with suspicion. Delays occurred when individuals struggled to explain their destination or purpose. Interactions varied depending on the unit controlling the checkpoint and the conditions of the ongoing operation. Evacuation of settlements involved searches for hidden weapons or documents. Soldiers sometimes removed items thought to have potential value to the opposition. Advisors who observed the cumulative effect of these practices reported concerns. They noted that the treatment of civilians complicated efforts to gain cooperation. Instances where those detained had no link to armed groups undermined trust. Some officials suggested that harm caused during operations strengthened support for the opposition. These observations were circulated in correspondence but did not often lead to changes in practice. The expanded use of force during interrogations and field operations stemmed from the same central assumption that inhabitants of contested locations were likely to be engaged in activities supporting combatants. Programs intended to improve relations with communities faced challenges in this environment. Distribution of supplies or information campaigns attempted to build trust. However, these efforts occurred alongside operations that disrupted homes, removed people for questioning, or resulted in injury or death. Civilians experienced the war through interactions with soldiers who offered both assistance and enforced military rule. Commanders with reservations about these practices reported difficulty balancing operational objectives with the need to avoid unnecessary suffering. Some attempted to adjust procedures to prioritize civilian safety, and their efforts were limited by the framework that defined success. If results declined, the adjustments were often reversed. Before the operation at My Lai took place in March 1968, civilian deaths had already occurred in comparable circumstances across several provinces. Internal records and field reports documented incidents in which forces entered settlements expecting armed resistance and encountered unarmed families instead. These events did not generate public attention at the time. They remained within command channels as routine results of operations. In the months leading up to the My Lai massacre, units in the surrounding area experienced increasing casualties from mines and sudden attacks by small groups. Commanders concluded that settlements nearby were providing assistance to those carrying out the attacks. Orders emphasized that enemy fighters were concealed among inhabitants. The operation was launched with the expectation a significant number of opposition forces would be present. Intelligence assessments pointed to the area as a hub for resistance activity. The lack of clear information meant that assumptions guided decisions. Documentation after the event recorded a high number of lives lost and very few weapons recovered. This pattern was consistent with earlier operations elsewhere in the country. Internal memoranda compared recorded totals with available intelligence and noted significant gaps. Operational summaries continued to classify those killed as combatants. Similar incidents occurred in Bindin province in 1966 and 1967, where settlements were struck under the assumption of armed resistance. Homes were destroyed, and inhabitants attempting to flee were killed. Investigations later confirmed that many of the dead had no connection to the Viet Cong at all. In Cang Nam, cases of people detained during operations and later found dead appeared in internal files. Statements collected from soldiers indicated that acts of violence were justified in the moment by concerns that detainees might rejoin armed forces. These conclusions were accepted without further review. The incidents did not prompt reassessment of policies governing detention. Command-level reviews of these earlier events took a narrow focus. The primary question was whether orders had been followed. Examinations did not address whether the orders themselves created the risks. Even when findings acknowledged that unarmed people had been harmed, recommendations concentrated on improving discipline rather than altering the game plan. The significance of My Lai became visible only when information reached audiences outside formal channels. The event prompted public scrutiny not because it was fundamentally different from prior cases, but because it eventually received attention beyond the military. Once examined closely, the incident challenged assumptions that civilian harm was limited or accidental. It raised questions about practices that had been accepted elsewhere without similar examination. Patterns established well before My Lai remained in effect after the operation. Settlements continued to be cleared, lives continued to be lost without clear confirmation of enemy involvement. Attempts to modify strategy were limited, while the broader conflict persisted. The structural forces that allowed My Lai to occur did not disappear with awareness of the event. Understanding My Lai requires recognizing the event reflected the logic of the conflict. Policies that treated communities as potential extensions of the opposition created conditions in which civilian deaths were likely. When combined with the pressure to demonstrate progress, the structure ensured that outcomes recorded as successes often involved civilians who had no part in opposition activity. The consequences of wartime policy continued long after active operations ended. Families displaced by clearance measures faced ongoing challenges when attempting to rebuild their lives. Land to which they returned was sometimes damaged or unsafe due to unexploded ordnance requiring assistance and clearance that arrived slowly. Property records did not always survive relocation, making it difficult to resolve claims. Health effects persisted as well. People injured during operations encountered barriers to medical treatment. Facilities in towns and camps were often designed for temporary support rather than long-term care. Some who survived lived with disabilities that limited their ability to work. Aid organizations later documented high numbers of untreated injuries among communities that experienced repeated operations. Psychological effects were widespread but not fully recorded at the time. Communities that had faced frequent clearance or night searches described unease when moving through former operation zones. Interviews conducted years later revealed concerns about the unpredictability of encounters with armed units. These recollections suggested that conflict introduced lasting anxiety into daily life. Changes in settlement patterns also had a lasting impact. Areas once densely occupied saw populations reduced. Towns near bases expanded rapidly before struggling to maintain services once military support declined. Livelihoods that previously depended on land and local networks shifted towards wage labor, often in uncertain conditions. This transition reshaped both family structures and community relationships. Some displaced people never returned to their original homes. They established new settlements or remained in former camp locations after these areas were no longer required for military oversight. These developments altered regional demographics in ways not directly addressed by reconstruction plans. Former soldiers who had questioned practices during the war continued to report concerns in later years. Their accounts contributed to renewed efforts to understand the scale of civilian losses. These testimonies, preserved in interviews, legal documents, and oral history projects, confirmed that the harm observed at My Lai was consistent with outcomes others had witnessed elsewhere. Surviving civilians provided detailed information about conditions they had endured. They described the loss of family members, injuries that changed daily life, and the effort required to find food or work after displacement. These accounts appeared in local inquiries, humanitarian reports, and historical studies. They highlighted the immediate and long-term costs of policies that treated entire areas as unsafe. Efforts to compensate those harmed were limited by administrative rules. Programs designed to assist victims often required documentation that many could not provide. When death or destruction had been recorded as a combat result, families struggled to demonstrate eligibility for assistance. As a result, compensation did not match the scale of the loss. Researchers attempting to assess the full extent of civilian casualties relied on multiple sources: internal files, post-war interviews, and demographic analysis comparing population data before and after major operations. Estimates varied but consistently indicated that harm to non-combatants had been greater than publicly acknowledged during the conflict. The conflict's legacy continues to influence public discussion long after the final withdrawal of U.S. combat forces. Historians and legal scholars examined how structural pressures shaped decisions in their field. Their work demonstrated that widespread civilian suffering was not the result of isolated events, but a predictable outcome of the system guiding operations. These long-term evaluations provided clarity that internal inquiries had not achieved at the time. They connected actions on the ground to policy decisions made far away. They showed that the effects of the conflict extended beyond the years of fighting, shaping lives and communities into the decades that followed. Thank you for listening to Sleep with History. I hope by now you're resting easily, somewhere between thought and dream. If you're still awake, there are more stories waiting, journeys through other moments that shaped our world. You can find them here on Sleep with History. Until next time, sleep well and good night.